Well, first of all, I think we should hope and pray for the health of Her Majesty the Queen. She's got her family being called to her bedside at the moment, and we'll just have to hope that she does recover rather than we get the worst news. But we certainly, are grateful for the reign of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and I personally have been very fortunate to having met her when she visited Guernsey many years ago when I was a member of the Guernsey Parliament. So I know how gracious she can be, and also how formidable. But anyway, we can't say any more at this stage except to wish her well. It's sort of ironic that she's in such poor health today on the day that we had the first policy announcement of the new Prime Minister Liz Truss on how to deal with the energy crisis. And in Parliament today, she did release plans, or a good proportion of those plans, about how her government intends to deal with the energy crisis we've got at the moment. I think the main thing which came across to me, which was perhaps very dishonest, was the fact that not only she, but the leader of the opposition effectively blamed the crisis on President Putin's war in Ukraine, whereas if we were allowed to put the full facts forward, then the public would know that the blame for this conflict, which could have been resolved back in April if it hadn't been for the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson sort of intervening and offering President Zelensky a lot of money and arms, we would probably not be having this conflict even now. But it can't be denied that the main reason for this energy cost crisis is because of the government's policies on trade and the government's policies in respect of Russia. But anyway, on to perhaps hopefully some positive news. Everyone was expecting that the government would give some help with this energy crisis. It's interesting in that during the leadership campaign, Liz Truss didn't say anything about offering the sort of help she has ended up offering, because that wasn't on the table there. But I think what's happened is, coming into office, she had two choices. One was to give some help, and secondly was to end that ridiculous Ukraine and Russian policy. But anyway, what has actually happened is the government has come to an agreement with the energy companies, and what it means is for the average household, the energy costs won't go above £2,500 for the next 2 winters. Now, if you bear in mind the energy cap at the moment is 1,971, then you can see that the British public are going to have to contend with an energy price rise of over £500 above what we've actually seen so far. Now, we know that what we've seen so far has been pretty disastrous for a lot of individuals, a lot of families, a lot of businesses. A lot of businesses have gone under. So the fact that there's going to be another 500 on top of that for the average family is not good news at all. Now, that isn't related to if you actually use more gas and electricity, because if you do use more energy, then you will have to pay for it. So that cap is based on average usage. So people are still going to have to be very careful with their energy usage. Now, that's going to cost well over 100 billion. Some say it could be as much as 150 billion if you add all various other bits and pieces. But what the Prime Minister Liz Truss has decided to do is that will all be funded by borrowing, and that means that the public, the taxpayer, will, in the short or the long term, have to pay for that borrowing. And the opposition party, the Labour Party, and others, had suggested that should be a windfall tax to pay for at least a big proportion of this amount of money, and that was sadly discounted. And even though the Conservatives have done a form of windfall tax before, this hasn't been done this time, and I think it's been a big mistake. It's been due to dogma, because there's a wing at the party associated with this trust which is more bothered about their own political dogma, and they're prepared to take risks with that dogma, rather than sitting down and sensibly thinking what is the actual best thing to do. Anyway, having said that, this cap will be in existence for 2 years. There will be a much shorter period of support for businesses, a similar sort of level of support for businesses for 6 months, which will also apply to hospitals and schools, one or two other institutions. I would say that 6 months is not really satisfactory from the planning point of view, and will not be helpful at all. There's also plans to be a reduction in corporation tax, because there was going to be corporation tax increase next April, and they're planning for that not to go ahead. Well, that will actually lose about £11 billion worth of funding. There doesn't seem to be as yet any move on any VAT reduction on fuel or fuel duty reduction. That is a shame. But what there will be is there was a planned rise in national insurance contributions, 1.25% depending upon what sort of salary bracket you're in, and that's going to be done away with. But again, that will lose, I think, again about 10 or 12 billion pounds. So although that will be needed for some of the people concerned, all these supposed savings are adding up to the total amount of borrowing which the government is going to be doing. And the Prime Minister Liz Truss said, you can't tax your way out of a crisis, and obviously to an extent you can't do that, you can't overtax yourself out of a crisis, but in the same context you can't borrow your way out of a crisis, because the chickens come home to roost, and the amount of borrowing will be put on our children and grandchildren, which is perhaps not at all fair on them. But anyway, we've got an absolutely massive national debt which went up a huge amount at the end of the COVID-19 crisis, because we basically overspent and mismanaged during that period, spent well over 400 to 500 billion, and that's all been added to the national debt. And we've got one of the highest national debts in Europe. indeed compared with some other countries in the world. So this particular crisis, I've already said, is going to cost, give or take, 150 billion. Will probably be 200 billion, but even then, it's not going to be enough to get the energy prices down to what they were a year ago. Because, in fairness to the Liberal Democrat leader, he said the energy prices now were double what they were a year ago. So it's still a disastrous situation because the prices are too high, and you can contend with that. Now, one of the problems with this debate in Parliament and proposals today is it was, on the whole, dealing with the cost of energy situation. In respect to the cost of living, it only dealt with that in the extent that it confirms that the 400 cost of living allowance, which the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak had announced, that will stay in place. But we all know that the cost of living, cost of food, and all the other items which we depend upon, £400 over a period of a year, many months, is just insufficient. So what we've had is a Prime Minister supposedly dealing with the crisis. It's failed to deal with the energy price rise situation. It's just made it slightly less bad. It hasn't dealt with the cost of living crisis, hasn't dealt with the economy and going into recession, hasn't dealt with inflation and rising interest rates. And of course, interest rates will carry on rising when your government carries on borrowing. So it's not a good situation to be in. The government maintained that inflation will be 5% less because of measures they're taking with the Bank of England and other matters, but I think that will have to be seen. At the moment, businesses are going to get support, but it hasn't been clarified how much support they will get. So a period of more uncertainty for small businesses. Many of us have said that the COVID crisis was a means by which more businesses were effectively destroyed. And here we have another crisis where even more small businesses are destroyed. And this is a process towards what is called the Great Reset, where large globalist corporations end up taking more and more control, and individual businesses and individual family firms, medium-sized firms, they're more and more squeezed until they cannot survive. So these are things which must be fought against, and what is an absolute key criteria is to get members of Parliament to face this issue of the absolutely self-defeating Ukraine and Russian foreign policies, which are, no doubt about it, destroying the United Kingdom. And this is why this petition, which has been launched, the UK government to change from being a warmongering nation in the Ukraine to being a neutral, independent peacemaker, is so important. And you have to look at that in the context of the whole world. First of all, you have to look at it in the context of what's in British interest, and it's never been in British interest to be involved in the Ukraine. And Boris Johnson and indeed Liz Truss were never honest with the British public about what involvement with the Ukraine would involve. And clearly it's not just been this huge amount of 5 billion given for weapons and other aid. It's been so far now about 150 billion cost to the taxpayers in extra borrowing. But on top of that, it's the damage to the whole of our society, every section of society, which is absolutely terrible. But if you look at the world situation, those of us who would like the UK to be a peaceful influence in the world, what good does it do the world for us to encourage the continuation of a war, which anyone of any sense can see that Russia's going to win eventually? If we prolong this war, it means many thousands more innocent lives will be lost, both Russian and Ukrainian. Many of them young people who, in the armed forces and so on. From the Ukrainian point of view, they've been forced to have conscription. And also, if you continue with this conflict, there'll be more damage to the society there, more Ukrainian refugees. But if you look at the wider context of disruption of supplies to the world, a number of countries are being disrupted by not having essential foodstuffs, fertilizers, raw materials, oil, gas, and so on. Now, it's obviously in the interests of all countries for that to be restored. But what I think is really important for the public to be aware of, which our government has denied them the truth on, is the fact that it's only Western countries in the EU, in NATO, and a very small number of other countries in the world who are actually engaged in sanctions against Russia. The majority of the world, 7/8 of the world's population, are not sanctioning Russia, and they're doing their own energy deals with Russia, just as South Korea and Japan doing them. India did one not that long ago. Now, if you've got the majority of the world doing their own deals with Russia, what position does it make for the other countries who are not? Well, obviously it makes it worse and worse. And Russia has, not surprisingly, decided to shut off energy supplies to Germany, which in turn feeds a lot of other European countries. And when you think about it, that Germany and other countries have been arming the Ukraine to increase conflict over there, it's not really surprising. They haven't done it earlier. But I think when you're looking at a conflict like this and you get your own country involved, you have to look at the pros and cons. And in the case of the UK, it now seems that the UK government were aware of the consequences, but decided that the British public were going to have to suffer. And this actually came out in the last leadership debate at Wembley before the final votes were done. And it's quite clear that new Prime Minister Liz Truss expects the public to suffer for their proxy war in Ukraine. Now, this is exactly why this petition, which has been launched for the UK to be neutral and to be a peacemaker between Ukraine and Russia, is so important, is because the UK government, with all their actions of Ukraine, have never once asked for the consent of the British public for their policies, and to the great dismay of many of us, the opposition parties, and they confirmed this actually in Parliament today, that they were fully behind the government's policies on Ukraine. Now, that's not serving the interests of the British public, because quite clearly if the British public are going to have to suffer so much for this policy, then they're fully entitled to have their say on it. And if we're not going to get a choice between the parties because they all support the policy, then we must have a nationwide referendum. We had this on the EU because it was a cross-party issue, and we've got to have it on the Ukraine. We very nearly had it on COVID, but they did change the COVID policy in the end. And we really have to put the pressure on the government to get this petition signed. Otherwise, they're not going to be thinking again about this policy. They're just going to carry on doing it, and they'll certainly be supplying more arms and giving more billions to Ukraine. And what we've got to say is no more Ukraine first policy. Let us for once have a UK first policy. So anyway, I think the key thing about the debate in Parliament today is at least the public got some good news in the sense that perhaps 75% of their bills are going to be covered for energy. And I think that was an expectation which the vast majority of the public had. But if you go back to when all this started, back at the end of June of this year, we had people like the globalist left-wing Don't Pay organisation trying to put the blame, literally all of the blame for this, on the energy companies. Now, of course, they do deserve a lot of the blame, but that campaign was very successful because it left the government off the hook up until now, and under no pressure to change their disastrous Ukraine policy. So let's hope that people can now see that the Don't Pay organisation was actually indirectly helping the government. And now we've got to focus on getting the government to change this policy. And remember that, yes, of course, we feel the government should give more help, and there's lots of people who should be getting help from the government and they're not. And it's deplorable because there's going to be some very, very sad stories over the coming weeks. But we've had perhaps a campaign by the government to use other means to detract attention from their disastrous Ukraine policy. And you could see that with the leadership debates. They had 12 of them, and 11 of them effectively avoided the real issue about the Ukraine situation. And what people need to be talking about now, particularly the key politicians, are if we changed the UK government policy now and started being the peacemakers and ended the sanctions against Russia, how would that actually help? Well, the answer, I think, is pretty obvious. That would set in place a chain reaction amongst other countries who would also step back, and there would be a tendency for the prices to roll back. Now, we can still be a peacemaker from a position of strength, but if we don't go down that road pretty soon, we as a country are going to be in an absolutely desperate state, because we can see that the government hasn't got a proper plan. They say they've got an energy plan, but the reality is that plan cannot help in the next few years, and the United Kingdom cannot survive for the next 2 years on borrowing and borrowing. And what we need to do is look at what the United Kingdom government is actually proposing to do. They're proposing to bring fracking, and a lot of people are very upset about that across the political spectrum, particularly if it's in their own area. But that, we know, even if it was successful, would take years and years to bear fruit. The same with North Sea oil, although it's not quite so contentious. But the issue which really is contentious is the government's stated intention to have 25% of our energy from nuclear power within the next 20 or 30 years. Now, we know even from the conflicts in Ukraine how serious the issue of reactor safety is. We've seen a number of instances in the world where there have been absolute calamities at nuclear power stations. Yet, we've got a government who wants to have 25% nuclear power, and not only is it dangerous, it's actually incredibly costly. And there are other forms of renewable energy which are literally about 9 times cheaper. So what I do think about this is it's time for people in the green lobby to wake up and see that this Ukraine first policy is setting back the agenda which really people like to have. Now, because it's certainly doing it in terms of nuclear power. But ironically, Prime Minister Liz Truss has said she's not going to hold back on her 0-10 programme. So that nothing's been achieved with any of this at all. So I could say a lot more, but I think that will be another time. I think the absolutely essential thing is we've got to get support for this petition. We need to be in touch with our MPs and say, you know, we've had this. The support for the government is insufficient, and you know, we want this Ukraine policy to end. We don't want to saddle our children, grandchildren with a huge national debt, and we want, for once, the interests of the British citizens to be put first.